Today, we're teaching you the basics of photography using this window. But first, let's roll that intro. What's up guys, welcome to the channel. My name is Kyle of Till Death Do We Travel, where we bring you photography, videography, and travel advice from our time abroad. Today is gonna be a tutorial video. As I mentioned, we're gonna talk about the basics of photography, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, using this window as a little bit of an analogy. One of the most important things to get comfortable with when started out with photography is switching it into manual mode. Now, when you switch it into manual mode, you have control over all three of the main settings of the camera, which are shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Those together and their relationship to one another make up what's called the exposure triangle. Each of them has an interaction with one another, and when one is increased, the other can be or should be decreased, typically, to get the same exposure level. So we have shutter speed, which is how long the camera is open, how long the shutter is open. We have aperture, which is how wide open the lens gets. A lower number means it's open wider. And then we have ISO, which is the sensor's sensitivity to light. So let's take a little quick example with this window as an analogy to kind of make that a little bit more clear. Train's coming. So taking a look at our window analogy, shutter speed is how long I keep the shutters open. So I could really open them for a long time or a short time. That represents shutter speed. Similarly, I can open them really wide and let a lot of light in, or I can just open them just a little bit and let just a little bit of light in. And then the other way that I can change my sensitivity to light, so imagine I am the sensor, is I can put sunscreen on. Is that rubbed in? I know I technically can't get burned through the window, but if you look at how white I am and how many freckles I have, you'd be surprised you can get sunburned anywhere. So if I put more sunscreen on my face, then I am less sensitive to light. If I put no sunscreen on my face, then I'm more sensitive to light. Similarly, if I open the window for a very long time, I get more light on me. If I open it really wide, I get more light on me. So that's how we kind of think about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So we can start to see that these things could all kind of combine together to change the amount of light that I myself get on me. So I can put on a lot of sunscreen, I can open the shutters for less time, or I can open them less wide to give myself less light. The same would be true with your camera. So you can increase or decrease the shutter speed to let in more or less light. You can increase and decrease the aperture to let in more and less light. And you can increase and decrease your ISO to change your sensor's sensitivity to light. Now, each of these three things has an additional effect to it, right? Shutter speed can either freeze time by having it open for a very short amount of time, or it can make things quite blurry. So we can take a look at a couple examples of that. So this would be an example of something that's very frozen in time versus this shot, we've left the shutter open for a very long amount of time, and you can see that there's some motion blur in there. Now, if we take a look at aperture, aperture will kind of dictate how much is in focus versus out of focus. So on a portrait, for example, like this one, you can see that we have a very wide aperture. So it has just one thing, the face in focus, and everything else is blurred out. Similarly, we could do that on a landscape, right? We could have just one thing, the main element in focus, but then we could have the thing in the foreground or background blurred out as well. On the flip side, you can use a very closed aperture, such as f/22 at the very extreme end, to make sure that everything is in focus within your image. As a bonus, this can also be used to create things like starbursts. When the sun is coming around an object, you get a nice little sunburst, just like this. And then with ISO, this will dictate again how sensitive your camera is to light. So the higher your ISO, the more sensitivity to light it has, which is really good for dark scenarios, for example. So if you're inside or it's late at night, whatever it may be, you can increase your ISO to get more light into the frame. Now, the downside of that is obviously that you can introduce some noise into the image. So some cameras are better at handling low light than others. So the A7S II, for example, is one of the best at handling low light. This is the A7R2, which is pretty good at handling low light. And then some of your lower cameras, obviously, have a little bit of a difficulty, like an iPhone camera, for example, has a little bit of a difficulty in a low light scenario, which is why when you take an iPhone photo at night, it looks a little bit dark and grainy. So really the most important thing is that you start to master and figure out how each of these things can come into play. For the most part, increasing one by one stop will mean that you can decrease another one by 1 stop. So if you increase your aperture from 4 to 3.5, for example, that you've increased 1 stop of light coming in due to the aperture. So if you want the same exposure amount, you can then increase your shutter speed by 1 stop as well. So you can see now how all of these start to kind of form a triangle where if you increase one, you can decrease the other, increase one, decrease the other, increase one, decrease the other. So you should really commit these to memory and have them kind of almost second nature on your camera to start to get a sense of, okay, if I do this, I know that I can do this. Oh, I want to freeze the frame at this point, so I should then increase my aperture or increase my ISO to get the image properly exposed. So go ahead and start practicing this. Get yourself to turn on manual mode wherever possible. If you are still starting out, what you can do is you can put it in auto mode, take a few shots, and then think to yourself, I wonder what the camera would have done in that scenario. Now the camera's not always gonna get it right, but if you take that shot in auto mode and then go look at what settings it used, you can start to get a sense of, oh, okay, well now I know that if I had used those settings, this is what the shot would have looked like, and you can start playing around from there. So I really hope this was helpful for you guys. If it is, go ahead and play thumb with the like button, subscribe if you're not already, and we will see you in the next video. Peace.